Welcome, everyone, to the Fluent English community. I'm really happy you've decided to join us, and I'm genuinely excited to be a part of your journey towards mastering English. It doesn't matter if you're just beginning your adventure with the language or if you're already working hard to enhance your existing skills. This community is here to offer support and encouragement every single step of the way. I understand that learning a new language can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming, perhaps even daunting. There's new vocabulary, unfamiliar grammar, and the challenge of actually speaking. But that's precisely why this community exists. My main goal here is to make learning English feel as straightforward and, importantly, as enjoyable as possible for you. In this space, you won't find overly complicated grammar explanations that are hard to grasp, like intricate verb conjugations or obscure tense rules you might see in old textbooks. You also won't find long lists of vocabulary words that feel impossible to memorize, like trying to learn hundreds of unrelated terms at once. Instead, I'll be sharing practical advice, relatable stories from everyday life, and examples of common conversations. Think about things like how to order coffee, chat about your weekend, or understand common workplace phrases. The aim is to help you feel more comfortable and build real confidence when you speak English. Here at the Fluent English community, we're all about creating a welcoming and encouraging atmosphere, a place where you feel safe to practice. There's absolutely no need to worry about making mistakes. In fact, I actively encourage them. Why? Because making mistakes is a fundamental part of how we learn anything new, especially a language. You see, we all learn best by actually doing things, and every little error we make actually nudges us one step closer to improvement. Trust me, I've been in your shoes. I understand the difficulties and frustrations you might be facing right now. In this community, our focus is on learning English in a way that feels natural and intuitive. We'll start with simpler everyday interactions and gradually build up your skills from there. Whether you're learning English to get ahead in your job, perhaps aiming for a promotion or finding a better position, or maybe you want to explore new countries and travel the world with confidence, or simply connect with new people and make friends from different backgrounds. Whatever your reason, I'm here to help make sure you have the tools, the strategies, and the self assurance you need to communicate effectively. Think about it this way: learning a new language is a bit like learning to ride a bicycle. At first, you might feel a bit wobbly, unsure of yourself, and maybe you'll even stumble or fall a few times. That's perfectly normal, but with consistent practice, putting in that effort regularly, you'll find yourself getting stronger, more balanced, and much more confident. And just like a supportive friend helping you learn to ride, I'll be right here, cheering you on, offering guidance, and helping you get back up if you stumble along the way. So let's start this exciting journey together. In today's episode, I want to talk about taking those crucial first steps in learning English and why focusing on the fundamentals, the basics, is so important right from the beginning. Now that you know a little more about what the Fluent English community stands for, let's dive into the very first and perhaps one of the most important steps of your English learning journey: overcoming the fear of making mistakes. In this first chapter, I'm going to share some practical tips and insights on how you can learn to embrace mistakes, see them not as failures, but as valuable learning opportunities, and actually use them to your advantage. This shift in mindset will lay a strong foundation for building your confidence and making real progress in your learning journey. Learning a new language can be a path filled with excitement and discovery, but also its fair share of challenges. One of the most common hurdles many people encounter is the fear, that anxiety of making mistakes. I remember when my close friend, Maria, first started learning English. She was so nervous about speaking because she didn't want to sound silly or say something incorrectly. Every time she tried to form a sentence, you could see her hesitate, doubt herself, and often she'd just give up mid-thought. It was clear that this fear was really holding her back from making progress. She was genuinely afraid of making errors, but what she didn't quite realize back then was that mistakes aren't something to be feared or avoided at all costs. In fact, they are a crucial, absolutely essential part of the learning process. When I talked to Maria about her struggles, I shared something that really helped me when I was in a similar position. Mistakes are simply a sign that you're trying. They mean you're stepping outside your comfort zone, pushing your boundaries, and actively learning. So I encouraged her to just keep talking, even if it wasn't perfect, even if she stumbled over words. Over time, with practice and this gentle encouragement, Maria started to understand that mistakes were just stepping stones on the path to fluency. The more she spoke, the more she learned from those little errors, and soon enough, her confidence began to grow noticeably. I know that many people listening right now might feel the same way Maria did. You might worry about mispronouncing words, using the wrong grammar, or perhaps being misunderstood by others. These feelings are completely normal when learning something new and complex like a language. But I want to reassure you, everyone who speaks a language, even native speakers, makes mistakes. Nobody speaks perfectly all the time. Think about your own native language. Do you always use perfect grammar? Probably not. And guess what? That's absolutely okay. For instance, I was having a conversation just the other day with my colleague Sophia, who is a native English speaker. She was telling me how, even now as an adult, she still occasionally makes slips of the tongue or uses an awkward phrase. She shared a funny story about being at a dinner party once where she completely mixed up two words that sounded similar but had very different meanings. She ended up saying something totally unexpected and slightly embarrassing. Everyone had a good laugh, but instead of feeling ashamed, Sophia laughed along too and learned something from the situation. It's stories like Sophia's that remind me that making mistakes is just a normal human part of communication and learning. It's not a failure. It's simply an opportunity to learn and improve. When you make a mistake, you get a chance to correct it, to understand why it was wrong, and to become better. So I really want you to remember this. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Learn to embrace them. One thing that really helped Maria was practicing in a low pressure environment where she didn't feel the need to be perfect. She started talking to herself in English every day, out loud, just in her own space, maybe while cooking or walking. It sounds simple, but it made a huge difference. She wasn't focused on impressing anyone or getting every single word right. Instead, her focus was on expressing her thoughts, connecting with the language on her own terms, and learning from the little slip ups along the way. And this isn't just about speaking, it applies to all aspects of language learning. Whether you're writing an email, listening to a podcast, or reading an article, making mistakes is a natural part of the process. Every time you make an error, it's actually a sign that your brain is actively working, figuring things out, making connections, and adjusting its understanding. So please don't be scared to get things wrong. Every mistake is simply another step towards fluency. When you make a mistake, you learn something specific about the language itself. Maybe you mispronounce a word and someone gently corrects you. Or perhaps you use a phrase incorrectly, like saying, I am agree instead of I agree, and someone helps you understand the right way. That correction, that feedback is a gift because it helps you learn. And the more you learn, the more confident you become. Mistakes are part of your progress, not something to be ashamed of. I've seen this pattern with so many of my students and friends who have learned English over the years. They were all afraid at first, just like Maria. But once they started to accept their mistakes and view them as opportunities for growth, they made incredible progress. And I promise you, if you can adopt that same mindset, you will see results too. One of my other friends, Hannah, used to be absolutely terrified of speaking English in front of other people. She would practice diligently at home, reading aloud or repeating phrases, but the moment she had to speak in a real conversation, she would freeze up. But one day, she decided to take a leap of faith and joined an English conversation group that met locally. At first, she stumbled through her sentences, made plenty of mistakes, and felt quite awkward. But guess what? That was the turning point. The group was incredibly supportive, and nobody judged her for her errors. In fact, they all encouraged each other. Over time, Hannah became so much more confident. The more mistakes she made and learned from, the better her speaking became. So, my message to you today is clear. Do not be afraid to make mistakes. They are a natural and essential part of learning. The key is to keep going, keep practicing, keep trying, and keep embracing those mistakes. Because ultimately, they aren't roadblocks. They're simply opportunities to learn, to grow, and to get closer to fluency. As you continue on your language learning journey, always remember that it's okay to stumble, it's okay to sound imperfect. The most important thing is that you keep moving forward, keep putting in the practice, and most importantly, keep enjoying the process of learning. Now, I want to share a story about my friend Elena, who recently moved to London for a new job opportunity. She was incredibly excited about the move, but also a little apprehensive because she knew the language barrier would be a significant challenge for her. She had studied English for years in her home country, but mostly theoretically, focusing on grammar rules in textbooks and completing written exercises. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how much real life, everyday language would impact her daily life. On her very first day at her new job, she had an experience that left her feeling a bit unsure. As she walked into the office kitchen, a colleague smiled and said something like, "Hey, Elena, let's grab a coffee sometime." She was completely thrown off. What did grab a coffee mean? She knew the word grab could mean to take something quickly, but in this context, she couldn't quite grasp the full meaning of the expression. So she did something really important. Instead of just nodding awkwardly or staying silent, she asked politely, "I'm sorry, what do you mean by grab a coffee?" Her colleagues kindly explained that it was just a casual way of suggesting they go and get a coffee together, perhaps to chat. That small moment was a turning point for Elena. She realized that by actively listening to and practicing expressions like this, the kind people use naturally in conversation, she could significantly improve her understanding and fluency. The key was exposure to real, natural, spoken English in everyday situations, and then trying to repeat and use those phrases herself. Consistent practice of listening and repeating would help make these expressions feel more natural to her over time. Now, sometimes it might seem easier to just stick to learning from textbooks because everything is neatly structured and explained. But the real key to becoming fluent lies in listening actively and practicing consistently. The more you expose yourself to real conversations, whether through talking to people, watching movies, or listening to podcasts, the more you'll naturally absorb those everyday expressions and speech patterns. So, here's a practical tip. Whenever you hear a new phrase or expression that native speakers use, don't just try to memorize its definition. Try to repeat it out loud. Try using it in your own sentences. Make an effort to incorporate it into your daily practice or even your conversations. This active usage is what will make your English sound more fluid and natural over time. Now, take a moment to think about your own experiences. Have you ever encountered a situation where a common English expression left you feeling confused? How did you react when that happened? Did you ask for clarification like Elena, or did you try to guess the meaning? Reflecting on this can be really helpful. Now that we've talked about the power of repetition and how it helps you understand common expressions, let's dive into another crucial aspect of language learning: fully accepting mistakes and learning directly from them. Let me share another story, this time about my cousin Priya. She had been studying English for years, much like Elena, and felt she was pretty well prepared. However, when Priya first arrived in the United States for a study program, she quickly realized that the language used in everyday life was much more complex than she had anticipated. It wasn't just the vocabulary that was different. The speed, the pace at which people spoke, often left her feeling overwhelmed. During her first week at her part time job, her manager asked her to take a message over the phone. Priya felt confident initially, until she picked up the receiver and heard the person on the other end speaking extremely quickly. She couldn't catch everything being said, but instead of pretending she understood or just writing down what she thought she heard, she paused, apologized politely, and asked, "I'm sorry, could you please repeat that a little more slowly?" At first, she felt a bit embarrassed. She worried that asking for clarification might make her seem unprepared or unprofessional. But then she had a realization. Everyone makes mistakes, and it's better to ask than to misunderstand. Her colleagues were very reassuring and even helped her understand the message more clearly afterward. They told her that asking questions actually shows that you're committed to learning and improving, and importantly, it helps prevent misunderstandings down the line. This story is a great reminder that learning a language isn't a perfect, error free path. Mistakes are an inherent part of the journey, and they should be embraced, not feared. The key is to learn from them by asking questions when you're unsure and not being afraid to admit when you don't understand something. Priya found that with every little mistake she made and learned from, her confidence grew. She learned something new each time and became a better communicator. Now, I'm sure you've made mistakes too. We all have. Maybe you mispronounced a word or misunderstood a common phrase like break a leg, which means good luck, especially in performance. How did you handle it? Did you try to push through or did you ask for clarification like Priya? Remember, mistakes are like your undercover teachers. Every time you misunderstand something, it's a hidden opportunity for you to learn. So, when you find yourself in a situation where you don't quite understand something in English, don't hesitate to ask for clarification or even just admit, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. It's truly the best way to keep improving. Now that we've explored the importance of embracing mistakes, let's talk about a new challenge many learners face: dealing with slang and informal expressions. These can often be tricky, but once you start to understand them, you'll find they are essential for sounding more natural and relaxed in conversations. Let's explore this further. As I mentioned, slang and informal expressions can be quite challenging when you're learning English. Even if you feel confident with the basic grammar and vocabulary, these casual phrases can easily trip you up. I remember a time when my friend Lucy, who had been living in the UK for a few months, was really struggling to understand some of the local slang she heard at work. One day, Lucy was having a casual chat with her colleague, Kate, when Kate casually remarked, "Ugh, I'm absolutely knackered after that long meeting." Lucy just froze for a second, trying desperately to figure out what on earth knackered meant. She knew the conversation was about work and feeling tired, but knackered made absolutely no sense to her. Now, Lucy felt a bit hesitant to ask Kate directly about the word because she worried it might make her sound out of place or like she wasn't keeping up. But later, when she got home, she decided to look it up online. To her surprise, she found out that knackered is common informal British English, simply meaning very tired or exhausted. It was just one of many examples of how people use informal language in everyday speech without even thinking about it. One of the biggest challenges Lucy faced, and one you might encounter too, is that these slang terms and informal phrases often aren't taught in standard English textbooks or courses. They are the phrases people pick up and use naturally in conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. but you might not find them in formal lessons. And because slang can often be specific to a particular culture, like British versus American slang, or even a region within a country, it's easy to miss out on them if you haven't lived in an English speaking environment or interacted regularly with native speakers. The good news is that learning slang isn't impossible. It just takes time, patience, and consistent exposure. The more you listen to native speakers talking, whether it's through watching films or TV shows set in different English speaking countries, listening to podcasts, or having real conversations, the more you'll start to recognize these informal expressions. Eventually, you might even start using them yourself. I suggest that the next time you come across an unfamiliar phrase or slang word, don't panic. Take a moment. If you feel comfortable, ask the person what it means, or make a note of it and look it up later. Over time, you'll build up your own mental list of these informal phrases, and using them occasionally in the right context will help you sound more natural and feel more comfortable in casual English conversations. Now that we've touched on slang, let's dive into another important skill: understanding idiomatic expressions, often just called idioms. These are phrases that often don't make sense if you translate them word for word, but once you understand their intended meaning, they can really help you sound more fluent and understand native speakers better. Let's talk about a few examples. Idiomatic expressions, or idioms, can be a real challenge when you're learning a new language, especially English, because it's full of them. These are phrases that often make no logical sense if you try to translate them directly into your native language, which can make them very confusing at first. But understanding and even using idioms is an essential part of sounding natural and fluent, like a native speaker. I have a personal story about this. A few years ago, my cousin Isabel moved to the United States for a job. She had studied English for many years and felt quite confident about her grammar and vocabulary knowledge. However, when she first started working in an American office, she quickly realized that everyday conversations were peppered with idiomatic expressions that left her completely puzzled. One day, during a team meeting, her manager said something like, "Okay, team, great discussion, but let's put a pin in it for now and come back to it tomorrow." Isabel froze for a second. Put a pin in it? What did that possibly mean? She thought to herself, do I need to find an actual pin? But she quickly sensed from the context that it wasn't meant literally. In this common business idiom, to put a pin in it simply means to pause or temporarily stop discussing something with the intention of returning to it later. At first, Isabel felt a bit awkward for not understanding, but then she realized it was just part of the ongoing process of learning the nuances of the language. Idiomatic expressions are incredibly common in casual conversations, workplace discussions, and even in movies and books. If you want to become truly fluent and understand native speakers easily, you need to learn how to recognize, understand, and eventually even use them yourself. In fact, I encourage you to start paying closer attention to idioms when you encounter them in real life conversations or through media. Watch English language movies or TV series with subtitles first, perhaps. Listen to podcasts or read books and articles written for native speakers. Whenever you come across an idiom you don't know, like bite the bullet, meaning to face a difficult situation with courage, or get cold feet, meaning to become too scared to do something you had planned, jot it down. Look up its meaning and try to understand the context in which it was used. The more you practice recognizing and understanding idioms, the more natural it will become to use them appropriately in your own speech. Now that we've discussed idioms in general, let's focus on a specific situation where idiomatic phrases are frequently used: conversations in the workplace. You'll often hear specific expressions used in professional settings, and understanding them can make a big difference in your communication and how well you integrate into the team. Let's dive into that further. Workplace conversations make up a huge part of our daily interactions for many of us, and understanding how to communicate effectively in a professional environment is crucial. Whether you're collaborating with colleagues on a project, meeting with clients, or even just trying to understand the general office culture and banter, knowing what to say and how to say it is essential for success and feeling comfortable. I want to share a story about my friend Daniel. He had been working in an office in London for about 6 months when he found himself in a situation many language learners can relate to, feeling a bit lost during a fast paced meeting. Daniel had studied English for years, but the speed, the specific jargon, and the slightly different tone of workplace conversation were still challenging. During a team meeting, his manager said, "Okay, good points, everyone. Let's circle back to this next week after we have the sales figures." Daniel had no idea what circle back meant. He mentally pictured the team literally walking in a circle around the office. But of course, as he later found out, to circle back simply means to return to or revisit a topic or issue at a later time. In that moment, Daniel felt a bit lost and confused, but instead of just staying silent and hoping no one noticed, he decided to subtly ask a trusted colleague next to him for clarification after the meeting. Once he understood the phrase, he felt much more confident. He realized that the key to improving in these situations wasn't to pretend he knew everything, but rather not to be afraid to ask questions when needed. People generally don't expect you to know every single piece of jargon or idiom right away, especially if you're new or English isn't your first language. Asking for clarification actually shows that you're engaged, paying attention, and willing to learn. So, in your own work conversations, please don't hesitate to ask if you don't understand something. Simple phrases like, "Could you possibly clarify what circle back means?" Or, "Sorry, I didn't quite catch that last point. Could you repeat it?" can help you navigate situations where you might feel unsure without feeling embarrassed. It's much better to ask than to misunderstand an important instruction or discussion point. Now that we've talked about the workplace, let's shift gears and look at another common situation where English learners might face challenges: social events. Whether it's a dinner party with friends, a casual barbecue, or just chatting with acquaintances at a gathering, understanding and participating in social conversations is an important skill for building relationships and feeling included. Let's dive into this next. Social events are a big part of life for many people, and they can be both exciting and a little bit daunting, especially when English isn't your first language. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when you're trying to follow along or join in a conversation with native speakers, particularly if they're talking quickly, using a lot of slang, or referencing cultural things you might not be familiar with. But the truth is, these kinds of relaxed, informal situations are often the best opportunities you'll get to practice and genuinely improve your speaking and listening skills in a real world context. Let me tell you about a time my friend Julia was invited to a dinner party while she was living in an English speaking country. Julia had been practicing English for years and felt quite confident when it came to reading and writing, but speaking, especially spontaneous conversation, was still a challenge for her. At the party, she found herself surrounded by a group of people, animatedly chatting about their plans for the upcoming weekend. Everyone was speaking quite fast, laughing, and using informal language, and she felt a bit like an outsider struggling to keep up. One of the guests, Chloe, turned to Julia and asked friendly, "So, Julia, what's your game plan for the weekend?" Julia was caught completely off guard. She had no idea what game plan meant in this context. Was Chloe asking about her actual detailed schedule for the weekend, or was it something more figurative? Instead of just smiling vaguely or pretending she understood, Julia decided to speak up. She said with a little hesitation, "Excuse me, I'm not quite sure what you mean by game plan." Chloe laughed kindly and explained that it was just a casual, fun way of asking what Julia was planning to do over the weekend. It was a simple phrase, but it was new to Julia. By asking, she not only learned something valuable, but also felt more comfortable joining the rest of the conversation. Julia's experience taught her a very important lesson. Don't be afraid to ask questions, even in social settings where you might feel shy. Asking for clarification shows that you are engaged and interested in what the other person is saying. It can even be a way to build rapport and connect with people. Most people are happy to explain things. Over time, as you get more exposure to casual conversations and learn more of these common expressions, you'll naturally start to feel more at ease in these social situations. One of the most helpful things Julia did after that dinner party was to start actively listening to English podcasts and watching TV shows that featured natural, everyday conversations. She paid close attention to how people spoke in real life situations, noting down the phrases and idioms they used. The more she exposed herself to authentic, natural conversation, the easier it became for her to understand and participate. So, if you ever find yourself in a social situation where you're unsure about something being said, take a deep breath and just ask politely. It's far better than missing out on an important part of the conversation or feeling isolated. And like Julia, you'll likely find that over time, you start to feel much more confident and natural participating in social chats. Now that we've talked about navigating social events, let's dive back into something many people struggle with: understanding those tricky idioms and expressions. They can be challenging because they often don't make literal sense when translated directly, but with a little practice, you can definitely learn to decode them and even start using them in your own conversations. One of the biggest hurdles for many English learners is getting the hang of idiomatic expressions. These are those common phrases where the meaning of the whole phrase isn't directly related to the literal meaning of the individual words. For example, when someone says it's raining cats and dogs, they don't literally mean that animals are falling from the sky. It's just a colorful, although perhaps slightly old fashioned now, way of saying that it's raining very heavily. Let me share a story about my friend Megan, who had a funny experience trying to understand an idiom. Megan had been living in an English speaking country for several months and was starting to feel more comfortable with everyday conversations. One afternoon, she was chatting with her colleague, Ben, about some challenges she was facing with a difficult project at work. Ben listened patiently and then said encouragingly, "Well, you know what they say, Megan. When the going gets tough, the tough get going." Megan was a bit bewildered. The going gets tough, she thought. What on earth does that mean? She'd never heard the phrase before. In her mind, she was picturing people literally finding it difficult to walk somewhere when things got hard, maybe like trying to hike up a steep hill. Not quite understanding the phrase, but wanting to seem like she did, Megan just laughed nervously and said something like, "Yes, I guess I will. Go tough?" It was a slightly awkward moment, but Ben smiled kindly and took a moment to explain what the idiom actually meant. He clarified that when the going gets tough, the tough get going means that when situations become difficult or challenging, strong and determined people don't give up. They persevere and work even harder. Megan's experience is a perfect example of how idioms can be confusing at first. But the good news is, once you start hearing these phrases more often in different contexts, you'll begin to recognize them. You'll start to understand what people mean, even if the individual words don't seem to make logical sense initially. One helpful tip is to keep a small notebook or a digital list specifically for idioms and expressions you encounter. When you hear or read a new one, write it down. Note its meaning and try to include an example of how it's used in a sentence or situation. Later, you can review your list and even practice using the idioms in your own sentences or conversations when appropriate, of course. The more you expose yourself to these common expressions, the easier it will become to understand them and incorporate them naturally into your own speech. Let me tell you how Megan handled it. After her chat with Ben, she went home that evening and looked up some more common English idioms online. By the end of the week, she had actively tried to learn about 5 new phrases and their meanings. She felt much more prepared and confident the next time she heard an idiom in conversation. When Ben later mentioned something about someone barking up the wrong tree, meaning pursuing a mistaken line of thought or course of action, Megan didn't even blink. She knew exactly what he meant. She was starting to feel more like an insider with the language, and that was an exciting feeling. Now that we've tackled idioms, let's talk about another really important topic for language learners: the fear of making mistakes. So many people, especially when they're starting out, feel anxious about speaking because they're afraid of saying something wrong. But what if I told you that making mistakes is actually a huge part of the learning process? In fact, it's often one of the very best ways to improve. Let me tell you about my cousin, Nadia. She's been learning English for a while now, and like many others, she used to be terrified of making mistakes. The first time she had to speak up in a work meeting conducted in English, she was so nervous that she stumbled over her words quite a bit. She immediately apologized profusely, even though no one else in the meeting seemed to particularly mind or even notice much. Nadia felt embarrassed in the moment, but she quickly learned something important from that experience. Everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers sometimes, and it's perfectly okay to get things wrong occasionally. I think this fear of errors is something almost every language learner experiences, especially early on. But what if I told you that mistakes are actually like hidden gifts? Every single time you make a mistake, you learn something valuable. You identify an area where you need more practice or understanding, and that awareness is exactly how you improve. Think about it. Even native English speakers make grammatical errors all the time. Have you ever heard someone say something like, "I have went to the store yesterday"? That's not correct grammar. The correct forms are "I went" or "I have gone," but it's a common slip up. The key isn't to avoid mistakes entirely, which is impossible, but to notice them in your own speech and others and learn from them. In fact, the more you speak and practice, the less you'll find yourself worrying about getting things wrong. It becomes a more natural part of the communication process. And as you become more comfortable with the language overall, the easier it becomes to speak without constantly second guessing yourself or hesitating. Nadia started to realize this over a few weeks. Every time she made a small mistake while speaking, instead of getting flustered, she started to just smile inwardly, make a quick mental note of it, and then carry on with the conversation. She even began to almost look forward to catching these little errors because she knew each one was actively helping her get better. And let me tell you something amazing. As soon as Nadia started viewing mistakes as opportunities for growth rather than failures, her confidence absolutely soared. She found she could speak more freely and fluently without overthinking every single sentence. It was like a light bulb switched on for her, and that's exactly the kind of shift in perspective I hope for you too. Now that we've talked about embracing mistakes, let's switch gears slightly and focus on something that can really help build that confidence: actually practicing speaking with other people. One of the very best ways to improve your fluency is simply by having conversations with people who speak the language, even if you don't feel perfect yet. In fact, these real interactions can often be far more valuable than studying grammar rules for hours on end. One of the single most important things you can do on your language learning journey is to actively practice speaking. I'm sure many of you have heard this advice before, but it's repeated so often because it's absolutely true. Speaking with others is where the real progress happens. And I know what some of you might be thinking right now, but I'm not ready to have a conversation. My vocabulary isn't big enough, or I'm scared I'll sound silly or make too many mistakes. I completely understand that feeling. It can be intimidating at first. But let me share a quick story about my friend Ava. She was in exactly the same boat as many of you might be. She'd been studying English diligently for years, reading books and doing exercises, but she was always hesitant to actually speak the language. She thought she had to wait until her grammar was perfect and her vocabulary was vast before she could possibly have a real conversation with someone. But here's the truth: you don't need to wait for perfection. Perfection is an impossible goal anyway. Ava finally decided she had to take the plunge. She joined an online English conversation group. At first, she barely said a word. She mostly listened, nodded along, and tried her best to understand everything being said. But gradually, something amazing started to happen. As she kept showing up and listening, and eventually started contributing small comments, she became more comfortable. She realized that the other people in the group weren't there to judge her. They were supportive and encouraging. Nobody cared about her occasional mistakes. They were simply happy to hear her trying to communicate. The real breakthrough for Ava came when she started having one-on-one practice conversations with another member of the group. She was nervous before the first call, but she soon realized it wasn't nearly as scary as she had imagined. Her conversation partner wasn't focused on her perfect grammar. The focus was simply on understanding each other and communicating ideas. Ava started to feel her confidence growing with each conversation, and the more she practiced, the better she became. I think one of the biggest barriers to speaking is that fear of sounding foolish or incompetent. But here's something that might surprise you. The more you actually speak, the less power that fear will have over you. The mistakes won't seem like such a big deal anymore, and you'll actually start to enjoy the process of connecting with others through language. Remember, every single conversation, no matter how small or imperfect, is a valuable opportunity to learn, to grow, and to connect with someone new. Now that we've covered how crucial conversations are, let's talk about a tool that can really help you improve the listening skills needed for those conversations, making them feel even easier: listening to podcasts and watching videos in English. As we move forward on our English learning journey together, let's talk specifically about building confidence. Confidence is one of the most powerful tools you can develop as a language learner. Just like many of you listening, I've certainly faced moments where I felt unsure or insecure about my language skills. But one thing I've learned over time is this: confidence doesn't just magically appear overnight. It's something we actively build for ourselves through consistent practice and celebrating the small victories along the way. I'm thinking of a colleague I once had who was incredibly hesitant about speaking English. She was naturally quite shy, and the mere idea of speaking, even in front of just one other person, filled her with anxiety. But she was absolutely determined to improve. So she set herself a small, manageable goal. Every single day, she would talk to herself in English for just 5 minutes. It wasn't about being perfect or having complex conversations. It was simply about getting used to the physical act of speaking the language, hearing her own voice forming English words. At first, she admitted it felt a bit strange. She'd stand in front of the mirror and describe her day, explain what she was doing at that moment, or perhaps recount a simple story she'd read. Gradually, though, this tiny daily practice started to build into something more significant. As her comfort level grew, she began trying out simple phrases with friends she trusted. Then, eventually, she found herself feeling more comfortable speaking with strangers in shops or cafes. And now, she speaks confidently without that paralyzing fear she once felt. This story really highlights how powerful consistent, even small-scale practice can be. Confidence isn't something you're born with or without. It's built brick by brick through steady effort. And the best part is, it's never about achieving perfection. It's about being willing to try, even when you feel unsure. Every time you make that effort, every time you push yourself just slightly outside your comfort zone, perhaps by asking a question in English or trying to explain something, you are actively building that confidence muscle. Another example comes to mind. One of my friends, who had been learning English for years, told me she used to avoid speaking because she felt she was too slow. She felt it took her too long to find the right words, and she often paused during conversations, which made her feel self conscious and awkward. But after some encouragement, she decided to stop worrying so much about speaking fast and instead focused on speaking clearly. She gave herself permission to take her time, to pause and think if she needed to, without feeling rushed. And guess what happened? By intentionally slowing down, she actually became more confident. She realized that fluency isn't just about speed, it's primarily about clarity and successful communication. Now she speaks at her own comfortable pace, and there's no hesitation in her voice. She found a rhythm that works for her, and it made all the difference. So, my message to you is this: practice is the bedrock of confidence. Start wherever you are right now. Make small, consistent efforts every day, whether it's talking to yourself in English for a few minutes, reading a paragraph out loud, or having short, simple conversations with others. Every step you take, no matter how small it feels, truly matters. Don't get hung up on sounding perfect. Instead, focus on making gradual improvements. Celebrate every little milestone, understanding a joke, using a new phrase correctly, successfully ordering food. The more you practice, the more confident you will become. And believe me that growing confidence will empower you to keep moving forward on your English learning journey. As we continue on this path together, let's talk about one of the biggest challenges many of us face: engaging in real life conversations. It's one thing to study English from books, apps, or online lessons, but when we actually have to speak in spontaneous, real world situations, it can feel like a completely different experience. I know this from my own journey, and I've heard it echoed by so many people in our Fluent English community. It's incredibly easy to feel nervous or anxious when speaking English with others, especially if it's in an unfamiliar setting or with people you don't know well. I remember a time when I was just starting to practice my spoken English more actively. I was sitting in a coffee shop and there was a group of people chatting enthusiastically in English at the table next to mine. I felt this sudden urge to join their conversation, to practice my skills, but immediately my heart started beating faster. What if I made a mistake? What if I said something wrong or couldn't keep up? All these anxious thoughts flooded my mind. But then I had a moment of clarity. I realized that the only way to actually get better at having real conversations was to, well, have real conversations. So I took a deep breath, walked over to their table, and said something simple like, "Hi, excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear your interesting conversation. Would you mind if I joined you for a moment?" It was just a simple sentence, but in that moment, it felt like a huge leap. To my relief, they were incredibly welcoming. They invited me to sit down, and from there, the conversation just flowed. Sure, I definitely stumbled over some words. There were moments where I had to pause and think for a second before replying, but that's all part of the process. Nobody judged me. In fact, they seemed genuinely encouraging and appreciated that I was making the effort to speak with them. That experience taught me a really important lesson. We tend to overthink things and worry far too much about what other people might think of our English. But in reality, most people are simply happy that you're trying to communicate with them. The more we step outside our comfort zone and engage in these real interactions, the more we realize that those fears are often exaggerated in our own minds. Another story that comes to mind is from one of my close friends. She had been learning English for quite some time, but always avoided speaking in group settings. Her biggest fear was that others would notice her mistakes and judge her for them. One day, she decided she needed to challenge herself. She joined a local English language club that met once a week for casual conversation practice. The first couple of times she went, she felt incredibly nervous. She did stumble over some words, and there were moments of silence while she searched for the right phrase. But by the third meeting, she started to feel noticeably more relaxed. She observed that nobody was judging her at all. In fact, the atmosphere was very supportive, and people often encouraged her to keep going when she hesitated. This is something we all need to remember. Conversations are primarily about connection, not perfection. People aren't usually listening to critique your grammar. They want to understand your ideas, share experiences, and connect with you. And they genuinely appreciate the effort you put into communicating in their language. The more we practice in these real life situations, the more comfortable and natural the whole process becomes. So, the next time you have an opportunity to speak English, whether it's asking for directions, chatting with a colleague during a break, participating in a meeting, or talking with friends, take a deep breath and go for it. Try not to worry excessively about making mistakes. Every single conversation, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, is a chance to improve. And remember, the more you practice, the easier it truly becomes. I know from experience that listening can sometimes feel really challenging, especially when you encounter fast-paced conversations or accents you're not used to hearing. It can be frustrating when you don't catch every single word, and it might make you feel like you're falling behind or not understanding enough. But let me tell you, it is completely normal to struggle with listening comprehension, especially at the beginning. When I first started seriously practicing my English listening skills, I often felt overwhelmed when listening to native speakers. They seemed to talk so incredibly fast, and there were definitely moments, even entire conversations, where I couldn't understand everything they were saying. But just like with speaking, I didn't let that initial difficulty discourage me. Instead, I viewed it as an opportunity, a skill I needed to actively work on improving. One specific thing I did that really helped was to start listening to content that was specifically designed for English language learners. There are so many fantastic resources available now: podcasts, YouTube channels, audio courses created for people at different stages of their learning journey. These often feature speakers who talk a bit more slowly and clearly than in natural, rapid fire conversation. Sometimes they even repeat key points or explain vocabulary to make sure listeners understand. Listening to this kind of material helped me build a solid foundation and boost my listening confidence. Over time, as I felt more comfortable, I gradually moved on to more challenging material, like movies without subtitles, news broadcasts, or podcasts intended for native English speakers. And while it was certainly tough at first, I noticed I was gradually getting better at understanding. I also got into the habit of listening to English passively while I was doing other things, like commuting to work, going for a walk, or cooking dinner. This way, I wasn't solely focused on studying the language, but I was still absorbing the sounds, rhythms, and vocabulary in the background. You'd be surprised how much you can pick up just by letting the language surround you regularly. Another tip that really helped me, and one I've shared with many learners, is to focus on understanding the context. If you don't understand a specific word or phrase someone says, try to grasp the overall meaning of the sentence or the conversation based on the situation, the speaker's tone of voice, or the other words you do recognize. Even if you miss a few words here and there, you can often make an educated guess about the meaning. This approach allows you to stay engaged in the conversation without getting stuck or frustrated by individual unknown words. Now, one of my friends had a slightly different approach that worked wonders for improving her listening. She's a very visual learner, so instead of just listening to podcasts or watching shows, she made sure to use English subtitles whenever possible, especially at the beginning. By reading the words on the screen while simultaneously hearing them spoken aloud, she was able to connect the sounds with their written forms more effectively. This helped her become more aware of pronunciation nuances and spelling patterns, and it also allowed her to keep up better with faster speakers. The main point here is that there are many different ways to practice and improve your listening skills. You don't have to stick to just one method. Try out a variety of techniques: active listening to learner materials, passive listening during daily activities, focusing on context, using subtitles, and find what works best for your learning style. The more consistently you listen, the easier it will become to understand native speakers and follow along in conversations. So, make listening a regular part of your practice, and remember that the more you expose yourself to the language, the more you will naturally improve. In the previous chapter, we focused heavily on listening, but today we're going to talk about another essential skill in mastering English: reading. Reading is one of the most effective ways to significantly improve your vocabulary and deepen your understanding of English sentence structure. Much like listening, reading exposes you to how words and phrases are actually used in context, which makes learning new vocabulary feel much more natural and memorable compared to just memorizing word lists. When I was actively learning English, I spent a good amount of time reading various materials: books, online articles, blogs, even just social media posts in English. At the beginning, I consciously stuck to materials that were relatively easy for me to understand, like simple short stories or articles written for learners. For me, it was important to start with things I could comprehend reasonably well, so I wouldn't feel discouraged right from the start. Over time, as my vocabulary naturally expanded through reading, I gradually started tackling more complex texts, such as full-length novels, news articles from major publications, and even some nonfiction books on topics that interested me. One thing I really want to emphasize is the importance of making reading a regular habit. The more consistently you read, the more words and sentence patterns you will encounter. It's truly amazing how much vocabulary you can learn passively, just by seeing words used repeatedly in different contexts. Plus, when you see words again and again, it helps to solidify them in your memory much better than seeing them just once. That's why I highly recommend trying to make reading in English a daily habit, even if it's just for 15 or 20 minutes each day. This small, consistent effort really adds up and pays off significantly over time. A key tip for boosting your vocabulary through reading is to keep a notebook, physical or digital, handy while you read. Whenever you come across a new word or phrase you don't know, jot it down. Make sure to also note its meaning. You can look it up, and maybe even an example sentence showing how it was used in the text. Later, you can review these words and actively try to use them in your own speaking or writing practice. By actively engaging with the vocabulary you encounter, it becomes much easier to remember and integrate it into your own language skills. I also found that reading aloud helped me tremendously with my pronunciation and fluency. I wouldn't just read silently in my head, I would actually say the words out loud, paying attention to how each word sounded and how the sentences flowed together. This helped me get used to the rhythm, stress, and intonation patterns of spoken English. I highly recommend this technique to anyone who feels they struggle with pronunciation or speaking smoothly. It's a great way to practice the physical act of speaking while simultaneously building your vocabulary. Now, here's something I've shared with several learners who are just starting out with reading longer texts. If you find a particular passage or chapter challenging, don't feel pressured to rush through it. Take your time. Read it slowly. Try to understand each sentence and its meaning within the paragraph. You might even break the passage down into smaller chunks and try rereading them, focusing purely on comprehension. This slower, more deliberate approach helped me feel more confident when I eventually moved on to more difficult texts. And remember, it's perfectly okay, in fact, it's necessary, to look up words you don't know. That's an integral part of the learning process. Another friend of mine who was learning English around the same time I was decided he wanted to read novels by authors he admired. The catch, however, was that he chose to start reading the books in their original English versions, rather than translated versions. Yes, it was definitely more challenging for him at first, but he persevered. And over time, he gained not only a much better understanding of the language itself, but also a deeper connection to the culture and the author's original voice. Reading books in the original language really helped him appreciate the nuances of idioms, expressions, and wordplay that don't always translate well. If you're not sure where to start with reading, try finding books, articles, or blogs related to topics you're already interested in, perhaps your hobbies, your profession, or current events you follow. When you're reading something you genuinely care about, it's much easier to stay engaged and motivated. And as you read more and more, you'll notice improvements not just in your vocabulary, but also in your overall comprehension and comfort level with the English language. In the next chapter, we'll explore how practicing your writing skills can complement both your reading and listening practice. Writing is an excellent way to consolidate what you've learned and apply it in a meaningful, active way. Now that we've discussed the power of reading, let's dive into the importance of writing. Writing is one of the most powerful ways to solidify everything you've been learning so far. It helps you actively engage with the language, forcing you to think about word choice and sentence structure, and it allows you to practice using the new vocabulary and grammar rules you've encountered through your reading and listening activities. When I first started writing in English, I wasn't overly confident, but I knew from experience with other skills that writing would help reinforce my understanding of the language. Initially, I kept it very simple. I would write short paragraphs about my day, describe my hobbies, or maybe summarize an article I had read. The more I practiced, even these simple exercises, the more comfortable I felt expressing myself in written English. Here's a helpful tip. Try to write something in English every day, even if it's just a few sentences. Maybe a quick journal entry before bed, a comment on a blog post, or even just a shopping list in English. This helps you build a consistent routine, and before you know it, you'll find yourself feeling capable of writing longer and more complex pieces. I often wrote about my daily experiences, but you can write about anything that interests you. Your opinions on a movie, plans for the future, a description of a place you visited. The key is to practice regularly and perhaps occasionally challenge yourself with different topics and styles of writing. Descriptive, argumentative, narrative. For example, when I was learning, I challenged myself to write very short fictional stories. These little creative exercises allowed me to use new vocabulary I'd learned and experiment with different sentence structures in a fun, low-pressure way. I also paid attention to how native English speakers wrote, the kinds of phrases they used, how they structured their paragraphs, which helped me improve my own style. Yes, it felt a bit difficult at first, but over time, I definitely started to feel more comfortable and capable. Writing isn't just helpful for practicing vocabulary. It's also fantastic for improving your grammar. When you write, you have to actively think about how sentences are constructed, how different tenses are used correctly, like past simple versus present perfect, and how to use tricky things like articles, a and the, and prepositions, in, on, at, etc. This kind of focused practice can significantly improve your grasp of grammar, especially in areas you find challenging. If you're unsure how to start writing in English, don't worry. You can begin with very simple things. Keeping a daily journal is a classic and effective method. Writing short emails to friends, even if you just translate a message you'd normally send in your native language, is practical. Or you could even start a simple blog about your interests. The important thing is that you practice writing regularly, so you get used to the flow and structure of English sentences. One of my friends, who struggled quite a bit with grammar, started writing short essays about things she loved, like her favorite movies or books. She would focus on one specific grammatical aspect each time, like using descriptive adjectives correctly or explaining plot points using the past tense. Writing essays on topics she was passionate about not only improved her grammar, but also naturally expanded her vocabulary related to those topics. Plus, she actually found it enjoyable, which kept her motivated to continue practicing. Another technique I personally found effective was writing responses to questions or prompts I found on online forums or social media groups related to my interests. These short exchanges allowed me to interact with others in written English, and through reading their replies, I could see different ways people express themselves. This helped me refine my own writing style and feel more comfortable using English in real, albeit written, conversations. And of course, as with all language skills, don't be afraid to make mistakes when you write. Writing is a process, and nobody writes perfectly on the first try. The key is to keep practicing and aim to improve with each piece you write. If you have the opportunity to ask a native speaker or a more advanced English learner to look over your writing occasionally, they can often provide valuable feedback on areas where you can improve. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how you can bring all the skills we've discussed, listening, reading, writing, and speaking, together into an effective study routine that can really accelerate your progress. Now that we've covered the various essential aspects of language learning, embracing mistakes, listening, reading, writing, and speaking, it's time to think about how to bring it all together effectively. One of the best ways to make consistent progress on your English learning journey is by creating a study routine that works for you and incorporates practice in all these key areas: listening, reading, writing, and speaking. It's important to find a balance between these skills to develop well-rounded fluency. When I first started learning English seriously, I didn't really have a clear routine. I'd occasionally read an article here or watch a video there, maybe practice some grammar when I felt like it, but I wasn't doing it consistently. The moment I actually started structuring my learning time and creating a regular schedule for my practice activities, however small, was when I began to see real, noticeable progress. Having a study routine helps you stay focused, organized, and committed to achieving your language goals. One practical way to organize your routine is to dedicate specific days or specific blocks of time to different skills. For example, you could decide to focus on reading practice on Mondays and Wednesdays, tackle writing exercises on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and make a conscious effort to practice speaking on Fridays, perhaps finding a language partner or joining a conversation club. Listening practice can often be integrated easily into other parts of your day, like during your commute, while exercising, or even while having your morning coffee. Here's a simple breakdown of how I structured my own study routine when I was intensely focused on improving. Morning, e.g., 10 to 15 minutes. Start the day with a short listening exercise. I might listen to a short English podcast episode or watch a quick news clip or YouTube video in English, paying attention to pronunciation and any new vocabulary. Daytime, 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫𝐦𝐻 20 to 30 minutes. Dedicate a block of time specifically for reading. I would read online articles, chapters from a book, or news stories in English. I made sure to highlight or note down new words and look them up later to expand my vocabulary. Evening, e.g., 15 to 20 minutes. Spend some time on writing practice. I might write an entry in my English journal, compose a practice email, or work on a short paragraph summarizing something I learned that day. This active practice helped solidify what I'd encountered through listening and reading. Speaking practice, daily goal, approximately 15 minutes. Aim to speak English for at least 15 minutes every day. This could involve repeating phrases I heard during my listening practice, talking to myself about my plans, or having a brief chat with a friend or language exchange partner online. The absolute key here is consistency. Even if you only have a short amount of time available each day, try to use it wisely and stick to your plan as much as possible. It's also important not to overwhelm yourself by setting unrealistic goals right at the beginning. Start small, maybe just 10 minutes of focused practice per skill area, and gradually increase the time and complexity of your activities as you feel more comfortable and motivated. I know that life can get busy, and sometimes it's genuinely difficult to stick to a routine perfectly. However, I found that scheduling a fixed time for my practice each day, just like any other important appointment, made it much easier to follow through. For example, I started waking up just 20 minutes earlier than usual to fit in a quick listening exercise or write a short journal entry before the day got hectic. This small, consistent effort made a big difference in improving my skills over time. If you find yourself feeling stuck or like you're not making progress, don't be afraid to switch up your routine. Sometimes doing the exact same activities day after day can become repetitive and your motivation might dip. Experiment with different types of resources. Try listening to audiobooks instead of podcasts for a week. Explore different online courses or language learning apps, or find a new language exchange partner to practice speaking with. Keeping things fresh and interesting is vital for long term success. I know someone who was struggling with consistency. They started using a language learning app primarily to track their progress. They set small, achievable goals within the app, like learning 5 new vocabulary words each day, and the app sent them reminders to practice. This simple system helped them stay motivated, and within a few weeks, they had learned hundreds of new words and felt a real sense of accomplishment. Another friend of mine joined an informal study group where everyone practiced speaking and writing in English together. The group held weekly online meetings where they discussed different topics like recent news, travel experiences, or hobbies, all in English. This not only gave them valuable speaking practice, but also added an element of accountability and social connection to their learning routine, making it more enjoyable. In our next chapter, we'll delve deeper into the crucial topic of how to stay motivated over the long haul and how to effectively overcome the inevitable challenges and plateaus that arise when learning a new language. Learning a new language like English can be incredibly rewarding, offering so many new opportunities and connections, but let's be honest, it's also a journey filled with its fair share of challenges. There will inevitably be days when it feels like you're stuck, like you're not making any progress despite your efforts. You might struggle with specific aspects of the language, perhaps complex grammar rules or understanding fast native speech. These moments of difficulty and frustration are completely normal, and it's really important to know how to stay motivated and push through them. During the earlier stages of my own English learning journey, I often felt quite frustrated when I didn't understand something completely, or when I couldn't express myself exactly as clearly or fluently as I wanted to in my mind. However, over time, I learned to reframe these difficulties. I started to see them not as signs that I was failing, but rather as natural parts of the process, signs that I was actually pushing myself, stretching my abilities, and therefore growing. One thing that really helped me stay motivated during those tougher times was constantly reminding myself why I started learning English in the first place. What were my original goals? For me, it was primarily about being able to connect with people from different cultures, expanding my career opportunities, and gaining access to the vast amount of information and entertainment available in English. Keeping this bigger picture, my personal why, firmly in mind, helped me stay focused and determined, even when the day-to-day learning process felt slow or challenging. Another strategy I used to keep my motivation high was celebrating the small wins along the way. I didn't wait until I reached some mythical state of fluency to acknowledge my progress. I made a point of celebrating when I learned a new set of vocabulary words and actually used one in conversation, or when I understood a whole sentence in a movie without needing subtitles, or when I successfully explained something that I wouldn't have been able to articulate clearly just a few weeks before. These small victories, however minor they seemed, provided little boosts of encouragement that kept my spirits up and fueled my desire to continue. A specific technique that worked well for me was setting micro goals. Instead of aiming for a big abstract goal like become fluent, which can feel overwhelming, I broke it down into smaller, more manageable, and achievable milestones. For example, I might set a goal to learn and actively use 10 new phrasal verbs within a week, or to finish reading one chapter of an English book each month, or to have one short conversation entirely in English per week. These smaller attainable targets helped me maintain focus and provided a regular sense of accomplishment, which in turn kept me motivated. But there were definitely times when I felt genuinely stuck, like I'd hit a plateau. I remember one particular period where I felt like my progress had completely stalled. No matter how much I studied, I just didn't feel the same excitement or sense of improvement I had earlier. I decided I needed to shake things up, to change my approach, and thankfully, that made all the difference. I tried incorporating more interactive and varied resources into my routine. I started using language exchange apps more consistently to chat with native speakers. I actively sought out conversations, and I made an effort to listen to podcasts on topics I was truly passionate about, not just generic language lessons. This change of pace and focus helped me regain my enthusiasm and break through the plateau. Overcoming frustration is key. When you feel discouraged, take a moment to remind yourself that learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint. Be patient with yourself. Acknowledge that setbacks and periods of slower progress are a completely normal part of the learning curve for everyone. One person I know found that taking a short break, just a day or two away from actively studying, really helped when they felt completely overwhelmed. After that brief pause, they returned to their studies feeling refreshed and more prepared to tackle the challenges again. Some days will simply be harder than others, and that is absolutely okay. Learning English or any language isn't always a smooth, linear process upwards. There will be peaks and valleys, progress and plateaus, and it's vital to be kind and compassionate towards yourself during those difficult times. A friend of mine, for instance, started losing motivation when he encountered a significant language barrier at work. He couldn't express himself as confidently as he wanted during an important meeting, and he felt quite embarrassed afterwards. But instead of giving up, he took a step back, analyzed the situation, identified specifically what went wrong, e.g., lack of specific vocabulary, nervousness, and then took concrete actions to improve. He made it a point to practice relevant workplace English daily, focusing on presentation skills and vocabulary, and soon started seeing improvements and regained his confidence. Remember, motivation isn't something that's always just there. Sometimes you have to actively cultivate it. But when you focus on those small wins, celebrate your progress, and view challenges as learning opportunities, your motivation will grow over time. And when you do hit those inevitable plateaus, remind yourself that they're just a temporary part of the process, and with persistence and perhaps a change in strategy, you will break through eventually. In our final chapter, we'll talk about the importance of community and how finding other people who share your language learning journey can be incredibly helpful in staying motivated and making the process more enjoyable. Building confidence in speaking English can often feel like one of the most challenging aspects of learning the language. Many of us feel nervous, shy, or self-conscious when we have to speak, especially if we're worried about making pronunciation errors or using the wrong words. But here's something crucial that I've learned over time. The absolute key to improving your speaking skills and building that confidence is simply through consistent practice. The more you actually speak, the more comfortable and natural it will feel, and the more confident you will become. It really is okay to make mistakes along the way. In fact, as we've discussed, making those mistakes and learning from them is often one of the fastest ways to improve. Take a moment right now to think about how you feel when you're in a conversation in English. Perhaps you've had moments where you felt unsure of what to say next, or maybe you worried about how your accent sounded, or if people were judging your grammar. I know I've certainly been there myself, but it's so important to remember that everyone, no matter how fluent they might seem now, went through a similar process of learning and building confidence. I remember a time when my friend Grace was visiting an English-speaking country for the first time. She actually knew the language quite well from her studies back home. Her reading and writing were excellent. But when it came to actually speaking with native speakers in spontaneous, real life conversations, she felt incredibly intimidated. She would often hesitate, second guess herself, and sometimes even actively avoid situations where she might have to speak much. One day, however, she was in a situation where she simply had no choice but to speak up. She was ordering a coffee in a busy cafe, and the barista asked her a very simple, standard question: for here or to go? Meaning, will you drink it in the cafe or take it away? Grace froze for just a second, her mind blanking on the common response. But then she decided to just take a deep breath, push past the hesitation, and answer clearly: to go, please. And guess what? She did it. The world didn't end. The barista understood her perfectly, and she got her coffee. From that small moment onwards, Grace started to realize that speaking wasn't quite as terrifying as she had built it up to be in her mind. Of course, there were still moments of uncertainty and occasional stumbles, but every single time she pushed herself to practice, even in small ways, she got a little bit better, a little bit more comfortable. Bit by bit, her confidence grew. If you're struggling with speaking confidence right now, I really want to encourage you. Start small. You don't have to jump into complex debates right away. Try having simple, short conversations with friends who are supportive, or even just practice talking to yourself in English about your day. The more you actively practice the act of speaking, the more that confidence muscle will grow, and soon you'll find yourself able to speak more freely without overthinking every single word quite so much. Let's move on now and talk about another vital aspect of language learning that goes hand in hand with speaking: developing your listening skills. When it comes to truly mastering a language, listening effectively is just as crucial as speaking clearly. In fact, significantly improving your listening comprehension skills can have a massive positive impact on your overall fluency in English. If you can understand spoken English more easily, whether it's in conversations, movies, or meetings, you'll naturally feel more confident participating, and you'll also be able to pick up new vocabulary and grasp grammatical structures much more naturally just by hearing them used in context. One of the very best ways to enhance your listening skills is by deliberately exposing yourself to a wide variety of spoken English. This could involve watching movies or TV series, perhaps starting with ones you're familiar with, listening to podcasts on topics that genuinely interest you, tuning into English language radio stations or news broadcasts, or even just listening to music with English lyrics. The key is to find material that is both engaging for you and also at an appropriate level. Not so difficult that you feel completely lost and frustrated, but also not so easy that you're not challenging yourself to improve. I remember when I first started listening to English podcasts regularly. Initially, I definitely found it difficult to catch everything, especially when the hosts spoke quickly, used a lot of slang or informal language, or had accents I wasn't accustomed to. But I made a conscious decision not to let that initial difficulty discourage me. Instead, I would sometimes listen to the same podcast episode multiple times, each time trying to understand a little bit more than the last. Gradually, I started picking up words and phrases I had missed initially. My overall comprehension of spoken English steadily improved, and I began to feel much more comfortable listening to a broader range of English speakers and accents. Another helpful tip, as we touched on earlier, is to really focus on understanding the context of what you're hearing. Even if you don't understand every single word in a sentence or conversation, you can often figure out the general meaning based on the situation, the speaker's tone of voice, facial expressions if you're watching something, or the other words surrounding the unfamiliar ones. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle. You use the pieces you do understand to infer the meaning of the missing ones. Over time, you'll find that your brain gets much better at recognizing these patterns in the language, and you'll be able to understand more with less conscious effort. Additionally, please don't be afraid to utilize tools like subtitles. texts in English, ideally, or transcripts, especially when you're starting out or tackling particularly challenging material. They can be incredibly helpful in bridging the gap between what you hear and what you understand. As your listening skills improve, you can gradually start to rely on them less, challenging yourself to listen without the visual aid of the text. But remember, it's perfectly okay to use these supports initially. They are valuable learning tools. Listening is definitely a skill that improves incrementally with consistent time and practice. The more you actively expose yourself to spoken English in various forms, the more you'll start to notice improvements in your comprehension. And always keep in mind, the goal isn't necessarily to understand every single word perfectly, especially at first. It's more about grasping the overall message, understanding the main ideas, and following the flow of the conversation or narrative. Now that we've discussed the crucial skill of listening, let's explore another key component of language learning, reading. Let's talk about how actively reading in English can significantly help you expand your vocabulary and improve your overall language competence. Reading is genuinely one of the most effective and enjoyable ways to boost your English skills. When you read, you're not just encountering new vocabulary words, you're also seeing exactly how grammar works in real sentences and paragraphs written by native speakers or proficient non-native speakers. This exposure can help you internalize correct sentence structures, understand how ideas are connected, and ultimately become more fluent and natural in your own speaking and writing. A fantastic way to get started with reading more in English is to choose material that you genuinely find interesting and enjoyable. Whether it's a gripping novel, a blog about your favorite hobby, articles about current events, or even just engaging posts on social media platforms, it's crucial to find something that holds your attention. When you're actually captivated by the content, the learning process feels less like a chore and more like a pleasant activity you look forward to. I remember the first time I decided to tackle a full-length English novel. Initially, it felt a bit daunting trying to make my way through the pages, especially since I didn't know every single word. But I didn't let that stop me. I developed a habit. I would highlight or make a quick note of words I didn't understand as I read, and then I'd look them up later, maybe at the end of a chapter or a reading session. Gradually, through this consistent effort, my vocabulary expanded significantly, and I became much more confident reading longer and more complex texts. Another tip we've mentioned, but it bears repeating because it's so effective, is to try reading aloud sometimes. This practice can really help with your pronunciation, rhythm, and overall speaking fluency. When you read aloud, you're essentially practicing the physical act of speaking English without the added pressure of having to come up with the sentences yourself. Plus, actually hearing the words spoken, even by yourself, while seeing them written, can reinforce their meaning and improve your ability to recall them later. It's also beneficial to try reading across different genres and types of texts: fiction novels, nonfiction books, news articles, opinion pieces, academic papers, even instruction manuals. They all use slightly different styles of language, vocabulary, and sentence structures. Exposing yourself to this variety will broaden your understanding, expose you to a wider range of vocabulary and expressions, and help you become accustomed to different ways of writing and communicating ideas in English. Over time, you'll start to notice common patterns in the language, and your overall comprehension will undoubtedly improve. Don't worry if you don't understand everything perfectly the first time you read something. The goal, especially initially, isn't necessarily to comprehend every single word, but rather to grasp the main ideas and the overall meaning of the text. As you continue to read regularly, you'll notice that you start picking up more and more vocabulary and understanding more complex sentences naturally, often without even needing to consciously look things up. Reading is definitely a long-term skill that grows steadily over time with consistent practice. The more you read, the easier and more rewarding it becomes. So, Try to make it a habit to read something in English every day, even if it's just for a few minutes during a break or before bed. Consistency is the key, and before you know it, you'll have built a much stronger foundation of vocabulary and comprehension. Now, let's briefly touch again on how to practice speaking, a truly key component in becoming fluent and confident in English. Let's explore some practical ways you can boost your speaking skills and your confidence in using them. As we come towards the end of this episode, I really hope you've gained some valuable insights into how real life experiences, the messy, unpredictable, sometimes confusing parts, truly shape your English learning journey. From navigating challenging conversations at work to encountering unexpected phrases in social settings, we've seen how these real world situations are absolutely essential for building genuine confidence and practical fluency. Remember the key takeaway: the more you expose yourself to these kinds of situations, the more comfortable and capable you will become over time. Now, I'd love to hear from you, our wonderful Fluent English community. Have you faced any similar challenges, funny misunderstandings, or perhaps moments of triumph while speaking English in the real world? Please share your stories and experiences with us in the comments section below this episode. Let's create a supportive space where we can all learn from each other's journeys. Your experiences might just help someone else who is facing the same hurdles, and together we can continue to improve our skills. And please, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the Fluent English Community podcast or channel. We're here to support each other every step of the way, and by subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our future episodes, packed with practical tips and encouragement designed to help you on your learning adventure. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm really looking forward to reading your comments and hearing your stories. Keep practicing, stay motivated, celebrate your progress, and always remember, every challenge you face is simply another opportunity for growth.